Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about the US elections. I'm going to break down the main policy ideas of both parties. What are the differences between Trump and Kamala Harris? Some policies are unique to this election, but most are consistent with what Democrats and Republicans have been saying for a long time. So let's use this election to look at the main ideas of both parties over the past few decades and analyze their potential impact on the economy and the market. Sounds interesting, right? I thought I knew this stuff, but I learned a lot while researching. Before we start, I want to clarify that we'll be focusing mainly on economic policies and their impact. We won't discuss other issues that people often argue about. I'm trying my best to be unbiased in discussing the policies of both sides. If you feel like I'm leaning towards one side, don't overthink it. I'm really not. It just means I might not have balanced it well, which is tricky. Thanks for understanding. The two parties are the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. The Republican candidate is Donald Trump. Their color is red, and their animal is the elephant. The Democratic candidate is Kamala Harris. Their color is blue, and their animal is the donkey. We'll divide their policy directions into these main categories: taxes, government spending, trade, immigration, and regulation. Let's start with taxes, which I think has the biggest economic impact. The simplest way to put it is that Trump supports tax cuts, while Kamala Harris supports tax increases. Trump mainly wants to cut taxes for the wealthy and corporations. Under Obama, the US corporate tax rate was 35%, but when Trump came to power, he slashed it to 21%. This time, Trump says 21% is still too high and he can cut it further. For US manufacturing companies, he proposes cutting it from 21% to 15%, which is almost on par with some tax havens. On the other hand, Kamala Harris supports tax cuts for small and medium-sized businesses by increasing tax deductions. But that's not her main focus. She wants to increase the corporate tax rate for large companies to 28%. For individuals, she wants to increase aid for low-income families, like providing more money and tax breaks for families with children. But for the wealthy, those earning over $400,000 a year, she proposes tax increases. Those earning over $1 million a year would face even higher taxes, as well as higher capital gains taxes. She also proposes increasing taxes on stock buybacks and setting a minimum tax rate for billionaires. Clearly, Democrats want to raise taxes on large corporations and the wealthy. Of course, these are just general statements about their proposed policies. The actual implementation might differ, and they might not even implement everything they promised. So I won't go into too much detail. We've talked about their differences in tax policies. What different outcomes could they lead to? First, there's the difference in debt. The most direct impact on the global market isn't taxes, trade, or regulation, but US national debt. The world's most important currency is the US dollar, and its core is the interest rate. What determines the interest rate? In the short term, it's the Federal Reserve, but in the long term, it's the national debt. The more debt issued, the higher the supply, the lower the price, and the higher the interest rate. We won't go into detail about that. Of course, neither of them will say they'll borrow a lot of money during their campaigns. But we can do the math. If they cut taxes without reducing spending, where will the money come from? They'll have to borrow it. In short, if Trump is elected, the debt will increase faster. Democrats will also borrow money, but overall, their budget will be slightly more restrained. The current US national debt is $28 trillion, about 99% of GDP. Bloomberg estimates that if Trump is elected, the debt will climb to 116% of GDP by 2028, while under Kamala Harris, it will rise to 109%. So you see, both will increase the national debt, but Trump will be more aggressive. Let me add a side note here. Some of you might have questions about the numbers we just mentioned. Didn't the US government already exceed the $31 trillion debt ceiling? Why did you say $28 trillion? You're right. The US government's nominal debt is actually over 35 trillion. But the 28 trillion I mentioned is its public debt. What does this mean? A large portion of the debt is held by US government agencies themselves, such as Social Security funds, Medicare funds, and civil servant funds. It's kind of like owing money to yourself. If we consider the entire US government as a whole, its debt is about $28 trillion or 99% of GDP. In addition to the difference in debt, if Trump is elected, there may be more foreign investment flowing into the United States. Think about it. He's cutting taxes for businesses, the wealthy, and investments. Naturally, this will attract more foreign investment compared to the Democrats. During his previous term, he did bring a lot of multinational capital back to the United States. Also, Trump's tax cuts will definitely stimulate the economy in the short term, so he will also be more inclined to favor the capital market and the stock market. On the other hand, Democrats are raising taxes on the wealthy, which will reduce the gap between the rich and the poor. Okay, we've talked about taxes, which is how the government collects money. Next is how the government spends money, right? We all know that the US government already spends a lot of money. Historically, both parties have spent a lot. The difference between them is not in the amount spent, but in the direction of spending. Trump emphasizes spending on defense. Kamala Harris focuses on social welfare, such as subsidies for families with children, assistance for low-income people, what they call Social Security, including education, healthcare, and so on. In short, they focus on universal welfare and believe the government should spend more in these areas. This is not unique to Kamala Harris, as it's a basic tenet of the Democratic Party. Look at the previous presidents like Obama with Obamacare, universal healthcare, and Biden sending money to everyone, right? They all support low-income people. Let's look at the long-term consequences. It's hard to say whether the government should spend money on healthcare and social security or on defense in the long run. Let's just look at the short term. First of all, the Democratic Party's policies are protective and will definitely reduce the gap between the rich and the poor in the short term. There's no doubt about that. But there's another interesting phenomenon. I was surprised when I saw this number. Look at the past 6 US presidents. There were 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans. Democrats were in office for 1 more term, so the time is roughly the same. If we look at the new jobs created in the US over the past 35 years, about 51 million jobs were added, and 96% of them, 49 million, were created during Democratic presidencies. Only 4% were created during Republican presidencies. That's hard to imagine, isn't it? In fact, since World War II, there has been a significant correlation between employment and political parties. It seems that the Democratic Party is indeed better at stimulating employment. I think this is mainly because, on the one hand, they focus more on government spending, and on the other hand, they pay more attention to the employment of low-income people. After all, they are the majority, so the overall employment data will look better. The next big difference between the two parties is trade. Their general direction is deglobalization and trade protectionism. They want to keep jobs in America, especially targeting China. They are actually quite united on this front, with trade tariffs and technology blockades. Looking at the overall trade policy, the Republican Party under Trump is more aggressive. We all know that Trump loves tariffs. He said he wants to increase tariffs on all goods to at least 10% or even 20%. Note that this applies to all tariffs, and for Chinese goods, tariffs should be increased to at least 60%. Tariffs on Mexican imports should also be increased, as well as on those using US dollars. Of course, if he is elected, we don't know how much of this will actually be implemented. But his aggressive protectionist stance is very clear. Kamala Harris hasn't said much about her trade policies towards Europe, Japan, and Canada. Overall, she seems relatively friendly. Her main target is China. So for China, it doesn't really matter who wins. Both will impose sanctions. It's Europe and Japan that are worried, especially Europe. They're probably thinking, Trump, you've gotten too big for your britches. You want to impose tariffs on our trade and withdraw from the Paris Agreement. You really don't take us seriously. I'm telling you, many mainstream media outlets in Europe even say that the biggest risk for Europe in 2024 is the US election. Christine Lagarde, president of the European Central Bank, put it more bluntly. She said that if Trump is elected, it will be a threat to Europe. Okay, what will be the consequences of Trump's aggressive trade protectionist policies? It's hard to predict in the long run. You see, he will definitely face strong backlash from other countries. How will the EU react? How will China react? Will the sanctions escalate? Or will negotiations lead to a gradual easing of tensions? That's not for me to analyze. Although there are many uncertainties in the long term, one thing is certain: there will be more uncertainty under Trump. You can imagine that if Trump is re-elected as President of the United States, leaders, investors, and media around the world will be on edge. In short, his uncertainty will increase. Trump may disrupt global markets and the global economy. He will bring more uncertainty to the market and lead everyone to hedge in advance. Trump's aggressive tariff policies will indeed increase the US government's tariff revenue in the short term. This is actually a major selling point for Trump. He tells the American people, I'm cutting your taxes. Where will the money come from? We'll get it from foreigners. Let's make America great again together. In fact, those who have studied economics should know that although tariffs seem to be collected from foreigners, regardless of which link collects them, the ultimate burden of these tariffs will likely fall on end consumers. What do I mean by that? Think about it. If you suddenly raise tariffs so aggressively, it will greatly increase the price of imported goods. What will this lead to? Everyone who holds US dollars will share the cost of these tariffs. Goldman Sachs estimates that for every 10% increase in effective tariffs, the core inflation rate in the United States will increase by 1 percentage point. Although we don't know how they came up with that estimate, the correlation between the two is quite strong. You may have noticed that we've been talking a lot about Trump today. It's true that his policies are quite distinctive. so there's more to talk about. Kamala Harris, on the other hand, is relatively moderate. If we talk too much about her, you might get bored. It's all for the sake of entertainment. All right, let's move on to immigration policies. We all know that the US is a nation of immigrants, and the current situation is that there are a large number of illegal immigrants. It is estimated that there are over 11 million, and about 2/3 of them are from Latin America. How to deal with these illegal immigrants? On this issue, the differences between the two parties are quite significant. Democrats generally have a relatively lenient attitude towards illegal immigrants, especially during Biden's term, when the number of illegal immigrants in the United States surged. In 2023 alone, more than 2 million illegal immigrants poured into the United States. However, Democrats later realized that they couldn't just let people in like that, so they began to tighten their stance on illegal immigration. But overall, Democrats are still relatively relaxed. Trump's stance, on the other hand, is very clear. Both his rhetoric and policies can be described as extreme. During the previous election, he said that these people were very dangerous and that we needed to build a wall, right? You've probably seen this kind of talk on social media a lot. This time, it's pretty much the same, with no sign of backing down. We need to build a longer wall, and he even said that he wants to drive out all illegal immigrants, to drive 15 to 20 million people out of the United States. Of course, this number is not realistic, but his attitude is very aggressive and very obvious. So what are the different outcomes of these policies? It's hard to say in the long run, but in the short term, if Trump reduces illegal immigration, it will, as he claims, allow more Americans to get jobs. But because the overall employed population has decreased, the direct result is that US GDP will decline. However, the market believes that this is not the biggest consequence. Although these illegal immigrants are large in number, the GDP they generate is relatively limited. But what do they contribute a lot to? Prices. You see, we're back to inflation. Think about it. These illegal immigrants generally have relatively low incomes, which suppresses prices in the United States. If they are all driven away, labor costs in the United States will soar, and the most direct impact will be on prices. Therefore, from the perspective of immigration policy, Trump will still stimulate inflation. Wow, look at how we've analyzed each policy one by one. Have you noticed that almost every one of Trump's policies will fuel inflation? And do you think inflation is the only consequence? No. Think about it. Once Trump comes to power and implements his tariff policies, what the market fears most is inflation in the United States. So the market will expect the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates to combat inflation. And the Fed raising interest rates is bad news for both the stock market and the bond market globally. So you see the chain: tariffs, expected inflation, expected Fed rate hikes, and a bearish market. And we just mentioned that Trump's tax cuts will benefit the capital market. So you see, just one party coming to power, its impact on the market can sometimes be contradictory. It's hard to say which one is more significant. It may also depend on the order in which the policies are implemented. Okay, the next big topic is regulation. This might sound a bit boring and you might not care that much, but it's actually very important. And the consequences are serious. Let's go through it quickly. Simply put, Trump and the Republicans tend to favor deregulation, both in finance and energy, especially for traditional energy. Democrats, on the other hand, tend to favor tighter regulation. You see, the Dodd-Frank Act, which tied Wall Street's hands and feet, was introduced during the Democratic era. Democrats also love to conduct antitrust investigations against big companies. So from a regulatory perspective, if Trump comes to power, it will benefit the financial industry, traditional energy, and big businesses. Democrats are the opposite. But on a side note, if Trump comes to power, it will benefit traditional energy, while Democrats strongly support new energy. You see, Biden recently signed the Inflation Reduction Act, which, despite its name, doesn't have much to do with inflation. Its main purpose is to subsidize and stimulate the new energy industry. If Kamala Harris comes to power, this kind of stimulus for new energy is likely to continue to increase. Trump, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. New energy? What new energy? He withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement. He will be more inclined to support traditional energy, including the traditional auto industry. Okay, we've looked at their policies and potential consequences from different angles, but some of them are indeed contradictory. So let's take a holistic view and see how these policies might impact the market. If Trump comes to power, compared to Kamala Harris, his policies, in theory, I said in theory, may lead to higher inflation, more national debt, a hotter capital market, a more closed global trade relationship, a wider gap between the rich and the poor, relatively fewer jobs, more capital inflows, a bullish stock market, especially for traditional energy and the financial industry. Looking at the overall picture, these tax, trade, regulatory, and immigration policies of Democrats and Republicans might give you the impression that they are all over the place. I think there is a general underlying logic to distinguish between the policies of the two parties. Democrats tend to favor big government. They advocate for tax increases, especially on the wealthy, and for the government to help low-income people, provide universal health care, and stimulate employment. They prefer the government to collect money first and then take care of the welfare of the entire society. Republicans, on the other hand, are relatively more inclined towards small government and a free market. They advocate for tax cuts and deregulation, allowing the market to compete more freely. A typical Republican president was Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. When he took office, the United States had just experienced high inflation and aggressive interest rate hikes by the Federal Reserve, and the overall economy was weak. Reagan introduced his Reaganomics, which mainly consisted of 4 points. The overall idea was to create a very free and relaxed market, with the government staying out of the way. At that time, it even led to a wave of financial liberalization in Europe, Latin America, and Japan. You can also see the difference in their attitudes towards government employees. Democrats tend to favor strengthening the protection of civil servants and hiring more people. Trump and the Republicans say, no, why does the government need so many people? They should be fired. During his term, Trump even signed executive orders to make it easier to fire federal employees. In short, the difference between big government and small government is quite obvious. So I think it's easier to understand their policies from this perspective. Therefore, historically, with the alternation of these two parties in power, the economy and the market have also experienced relatively obvious cycles. For example, Republicans cut taxes and deregulate, which the market definitely likes. Generally, the overall market economy will perform relatively well, sometimes even overheating, in different historical periods. Different parties come to power according to the needs of the economy and the market. I feel that the propositions of these two parties are somewhat similar to the two major schools of economic Keynesianism and Friedman's monetarism. Keynesianism emphasizes the importance of government, arguing that the economy itself is prone to problems, so the government needs to stimulate and manage it. This is somewhat similar to the Democratic Party's proposition. Monetarism, on the other hand, believes that the economy should be left to free competition with minimal government intervention. The Federal Reserve should just control the money supply and interest rates. This is somewhat similar to the Republican Party's small government philosophy. It's just that I think they are somewhat similar, not absolute. If you are interested in these economic schools of thought and theories, we can talk about them another time. Of course, there are some policy directions that both parties agree on, and they will be implemented regardless of who comes to power. For example, they will continue to increase the national debt to stimulate the economy, although Trump may issue more. They will also continue their trade protectionism, especially against China, although Trump may be more aggressive. For another example, they both claim to want to reduce inflation, but most of their actual policies do the opposite. I guess inflation will eventually have to be dealt with by the Fed raising interest rates. There is another policy that I find quite funny and baffling, which both parties agree on. All tips are tax-free. This policy is actually nothing special. It's just a small point, and there is no economic theory that says that not taxing tips can help the economy. It's purely for the sake of elections and politics. So that's my summary and analysis of the economic policies of both sides and their potential consequences. I hope this gives you a general understanding.